as I began the juring process, I had to think about the theme of the exhibit and contextualize my mindset about what the images would appear as relative to that thematic basis. So if I make some reference to the juror's statement, it might clarify that a little bit. So let me go ahead and read that. Light reveals, discloses, differentiates both in the physical and metaphorical sense. It shapes and characterizes form. There is no shadow without some level of light. And while it is the gradient that maps planes, surfaces, and spatial placements, it often hides, veils, and obscures. Light can be thought of as an opening up or clarifying, or it can be thought of as the source that forms shadows, and shadows in turn suggest emergence, envelopment, or the secret of what lurks within or behind. In the concert of light and shadow, there are mystery, mood, and structure. These are what I sought in reviewing the submissions for this exhibit, and these factors are aligned with the three elements I always employ when I study works of art, and they conveniently alliterate. They are concept, composition, and craft. And the thing to consider now is what each of these two terms means, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I want to say this about the show as a whole. You'll notice that there are a number of different mediums that are represented in the exhibit, and I really consciously attempted to get that representation at work in the exhibit. But it's to be said as well that there are a number of, and probably a majority of, digital photographs in the show. I am not that's not my area of expertise. I'm a painter, but these particular digital photographs were really, really outstanding and demonstrated a number of the things that I look for when I study works of art. Nonetheless, if you look closely at the exhibit, there is I think, a very good representation of a number of different mediums and processes, which I think an exhibit really needs to show. Now, let me go over these three terms of concept and composition and craft, because they're really critical in understanding how I go about evaluating work. Now, I've made art for, I don't want to say how many years I made art. A long time. And I taught art on the college level for 40 plus years. So I've got some experience, I have some background in looking at art and having to articulate about art. Because when you're talking with students or you're talking with or professional artists, they expect some level of lucidity in the comments that may be made about their work. They don't want anyone to give responses that really have no substance. Nonetheless, I should say this, that one of the drawbacks in talking about art is that sometimes words get in the way. And too many words really eliminate, the singular impact of a work of art. And we can't explain art away. Still, we try. We try to explain or try to engage in a certain level of communication, but no words are adequate to express that communication that occurs between the viewer and the artist. So, with that in mind, when I look at concept, when I determine what a concept is, I try to determine the theme, the idea, the genre, the subject, essentially the purpose behind the making of the art. And sometimes that's readily evident. And when we look at a work of art, we can tell it fits in a particular genre or a particular stylistic approach. We can categorize in that respect. But ultimately, we have to think about what the artist's intent was to present an idea in that work. Now, secondly, but not in terms of importance, but the second thing that I look at is composition. And that is the architecture of the work, how it is structured, how it maintains its structural integrity. And there are a number of things that I look for immediately in the work. How it's put together, but things to consider when it's put together. The relationship, in this particular case, we're dealing with primarily two-dimensional works. I look at the relationship of whatever is configured and the picture plane itself. What sort of correspondence is there between those two? I look for ways the eye is directed throughout that composition. I use terms such as axes, those directional movements that are often played overtly and sometimes in a very subtle way within the work of art. I look at grouping because some very successful artists are so skilled at creating clusters or groups of visual information that links from one region to another in the most satisfying fashion. Contrast, repetition, anomaly, how color is used. Personally, I think of myself as a colorist. I taught color theory, so I have this love for color, but I am very analytical when it comes to color. So these, among other things, I'm always looking at when I'm studying a work of art. So again, the composition is a structure. And then craft. How does the artist take material or process, demonstrate a skill, a technical skill and understanding of the characteristics, the potential of that material and process in order to create a union with the composition and the concept. So these things work in tandem. There's really no way effectively to differentiate all the time concept from composition from craft. In fact, in some examples of art, you'll have the concept is basically about the nature of composition. There are formal abstractionists whose conceptual basis is how this organizational structure says something about stability and consonance of parts. You have some artists whose approach is process orientation, and that becomes the subject. It becomes the concept after a certain point of familiarity with the use of materials in a particular way. And in fact, a lot of artists will begin with a kind of interest in or become enamored of a particular material or process, and through greater and greater exploration of that, will gain an understanding what the potential is in order to find a concept. So it doesn't, it's not that you have first a concept. How do I come up with a composition for this concept? And then what material should I use? The artist may be thinking, here I have these materials. I've got to say something with them. Or here, I've got this idea. I got to find some way to make a form that conveys it. So all these three things are working simultaneously. And the greatest works of art are so seamlessly unified in those three components. It's impossible to separate them entirely. So what I'm doing here in talking about the individual works is a feeble attempt at justifying why I see all these things happening simultaneously. But it tends to, when I talk about them, in fact, it might elucidate my reaction to the work of art, but it does tend to limit the subtleties and all the nuances that are going on within that work that words simply can't convey. What I'd like to do is look at the Juror's Choice Awards, and those are 5, and talk briefly about each one of them. And I think in many respects they represent the great characteristics of all the work in the exhibit. And I'm going to go over these, and they're not in any particular order, other than when I looked at them in the submission list. So the first one I'm going to go over is entitled Palm, and it was one of the works that was one of the first ones in the list of submissions. First, in terms of the conceptual basis of the work, if you take a look at the work, the artist has presented basically a still life, but for me, it's a vanitas still life, and I have a particular love for vanitas imagery. But this particular work presents in the upper area of the composition a cluster of hydrangea flowers, and beneath a cut open pomegranate. It's really visually rich in its content. We have to think of it in terms of the conceptual basis first, because you have these two images that suggest a certain degree of fecundity, fertility. But you have the pomegranate, which traditionally is this image of fertility. And flowers are usually associated with fertility, but flowers are also associated with funerals, with the full range of emotions, from the celebration of life to at birth or a wedding or some other festive event to a funeral. And to have these two juxtaposed starts off that whole dialogue of this vanitas situation. So it's a still life, but specifically vanitas that's presented in this particular image. Then we take a look at the compositional characteristics of the composition. The overall tonality of the composition is muted, although we see some highlights occurring within the flowers of the hydrangea and the highlights in the pomegranate. So there's this correspondence of light values from two different regions within the picture plane, and that is a kind of link in the composition. Further, the overall cluster of flowers and the shape of the pomegranate are circular. So there is this reinforcement of comparable shapes that occur. And then if you look at the overall space that's occupied by those two figures, they fit so intimately into the context of the picture plane. Other things to take in consideration in that work that demonstrates really intelligent and sensitive composition is that the artist realizes that the shape and scale of the individual seeds of the pomegranate are comparable to the shape and scale of the individual petals of the hydrangea flowers. And that correspondence is a repetition structure at work. These are two completely different images, and yet they show some comparable nature between them. Further, when you have these two shapes that resemble each other to a degree, and you realize that the pomegranate is about fertility that will emerge further, develop further at some point. The flower eventually is going to fade. The artist has captured the lighting in that particular work so that the flowers are in some areas illuminated, in other areas they're in shadow. So you get this sort of temporal shift that's suggested within that particular passage. All of this in that really beautiful, just exquisitely beautiful composition. And it's so simple, but it's loaded with content. And as far as the craft goes, the artist has demonstrated the use of digital photography to create some of the most striking qualities of rich, deep, blood red color, and some of the most subtle and nuanced and downplayed tonalities in other parts of the composition. It's really a beauty. And it's the kind of work that you want to look at and study over and over again. You can't simply pass it by and say, oh, it's pretty. It's haunting is what it is. And that's just a few of the reasons why I really engaged with that piece. And I still look at it and I think, wow, this is amazing. And then the second one is illumined, that I'll talk about. And that's an oil painting. In terms of the composition, in terms of the concept, immediately we see it's an interior, domestic interior. Could very well be the artist's living room with the artist's pet cat. So there's no how should we say, heroic statement here. There's no vanitas statement here. It's the playful image of a cat backlit with the sunlight coming in through the window. And it is perched on a sofa. Very, very simple domestic situation. But the composition is so beautifully complex and still so beautifully structured that you can't help but want to study every single aspect of it. For instance, the cat image is primarily in the center of the picture plane, but its shadow is cast beneath it. The dark value of the cat is linked to the shadow that casts. And so it becomes a larger passage. That shadow then links to a shape in the lower right part of the composition that is, in terms of visual weight, comparable to the shape of the cat. When I talk about visual weight, I'm talking about visual attraction. And sometimes an area that is an anomaly or that has some characteristic that is comparable to another area of the picture plane, but presented in a strategic location or with some sort of modification or intensification of a particular characteristic, draws a lot of weight to itself. And as a result, the artist has to be selective in creating counterpoints within the composition to balance these various weights within the picture plane. This particular work is what I would call an alleviated symmetry. It's not tightly bilateral, but it has an axis that is a directional line that cuts it right down the middle vertically. And then you have the top of the sofa that's on a curve, but that is sort of the horizontal counterpoint to that vertical. That creates the underlying matrix of the composition. And then there are a series of other verticals and horizontals that are all very subtle and understated that form the rest of the repetition structure within the composition. And you look at the window, for instance, it's open. There's one side where you have the panes that form the individual squares of the window. The other side is open. You have the interior view and you have the exterior view. So the artist is working with the idea of outside, inside as well. So the space becomes a complex statement. As far as the craft goes, if you've ever done oil painting, in the classical sense, where you form almost imperceptible gradations of color and tone with the various mediums that you have at your disposal, it is not an easy material to work with. You have to have a lot of years of practice to get things working so they look effortless. This particular example, I think, does that. It is glorious as an oil painting. It's picture perfect. It really is beautiful. Now, let me qualify that, Martha. Yeah, I don't think every single work of art has to be beautiful in order for it to be impactful. I mean, I can think of some works of art that are downright ugly, but they have a powerful concept. Their composition is holds together as it needs to present that concept. And the craft is precisely in keeping with what the intention of the artist is through the concept and the composition. It just so happens that this particular work is gorgeous. Sheltered, it is enigmatic in that it presents an image that does not reveal itself immediately, but we get an idea about what the contents may be when we look at the title of it, Sheltered. Here is this shrouded, ghost-like form. I mean, it does look ghost-like in the upper left part of the composition. It's suspended there, almost like a ghost image. What is beneath it? I mean, the assumption is that it's a bird cage beneath there. And the reason for that is that there's an egg in the lower part of the composition. You can barely see it. It requires the viewer really to look closely at that work to see what that subject may be. So we have this sort of disconnect between the bird cage, where the bird should be residing and may have produced the egg, and the egg being separated from its source. How do we resolve that? That's exactly the point. We cannot resolve this. And this is an example of how art sometimes, when it is enigmatic, will not clearly present its concept. It will not clearly present a singular idea, but it requires then that the viewer investigate it and exercise their own interpretation of the situation they see themselves looking at. I like art like this because it requires more of the speculative capabilities of the viewer. There's more of an engagement on the part between the work of art and the viewer. Now, in terms of the composition, another superb composition. The first thing that I noticed is that the overall area of occupation of that suspended cloth is proportionally related to the whole of the picture plane. It's basically a rectilinear shape. I mean, its length and width ratios are the same as that of the picture plane. So the artist is demonstrating an intimate relationship between the major subject of the composition and its context, its spatial context. That immediately caught my attention. Then you have this abrupt contrast, the anomaly of the suspended cloth as a bright light value, very much illuminated from a source outside the picture plane. And then everything else, for the most part, is dark in tonality. But in order to link that extreme light with that extreme dark, the artist has a soft shaft of diagonal light that moves from upper left to lower middle, and that links the two extreme entities of this composition. Further, the position of the cloth or the covered cage forms a vertical in the composition. You'll notice that in other areas of the composition, what I call the negative space or the background is also divided in these vertical regions. So there's this sort of reinforcement of the directional movement across the picture plane because of the position of these verticals, and also down the picture plane, taking us down to that egg, that solitary egg that's caught in the shadow and is kind of wanting to peek through, but simply can't. The impact is just, it's inexplicable. Other than what I said, I mean, what I said is inadequate, because when you look at this work, you really sense this sort of intrigue and things that are partially revealed and more so concealed. Also, I can't help but think of historical prototypes. I think of Caravaggio, for instance, Dutch Baroque painting. There's a whole lineage of works of art that this corresponds to. I happen to enjoy a great deal the creative approaches that artists have. That sometimes taps into historical prototypes, either knowingly or unknowingly. I mean, all of us who love art look at art, and so we can't help but be influenced by what we've seen and what we've studied, and that becomes part of our personal canon after a while. And I don't know if this particular artist was referencing artists of the Tenebrist artists, Caravaggio, de la Tour, and others, Rembrandt, or just had this passing love for things that are shrouded and concealed, but we can't help but link these things to things that have happened in the past. At the same time, I am equally enamored of works of art that effectively attempt to break away from historical models to produce something that is an attempt at getting completely innovative. But I find that very rare because we're always tied in some way to things that we've seen and thus to the past. And I think it's perfectly fine to do that. It shows that the artist knows something about art history. And I think that's really very, very important. And then there is Peach Alley. And this is a charcoal drawing. And this really captured my attention. Again, it's a domestic situation. It is a house within a landscape setting. But we can then kind of impose a narrative upon this. I mean, is it possible this is the artist's house, or the artist's neighbor's house, or is it the artist's childhood home? But we begin to, at least for me, impose a narrative upon it. And I don't think you can really break away from images of what it seems to be someone's home and not have a narrative suggested, and not then have nostalgia associated with it. And I find this work has that nostalgic quality to it. I want to think about what may have been there in the past, who occupied that space. So it does conform to the genre of landscape and domestic architecture. In terms of composition, this is so subtle in the way that it's presented. We might think immediately, we see, oh, it's a house on a plot of land and it's surrounded by trees. What we have here, and it's very similar to some of the other pieces I talked about, is the overall shape of the house. The main subject of the composition is the same shape as the picture plane. So the main subject is echoing the context in which it is placed. There's an intimacy in that I think is so critical in the success of this particular work. But the artist isn't satisfied with just that obvious connection of inside and outside. If you look, you'll see that the interval between the top part of the picture plane to the top edge of the frontal plane of the house is roughly equivalent to that plane of the house. Also, the space from the left edge of the picture plane to the left edge of the house is roughly equivalent to the interval of that house width and length. So the artist is looking for these ways of creating the same kind of interval in other areas as well within the picture plane to reinforce this kind of unity. The whole picture plane also is divided into kind of subtle thirds, which is a classical means by which balance and visual integrity were achieved. The artist is also dealing with repetition structures. We can't get away from the fact that the house has a repetition of windows that are over the surface of that house. They form a recurrence of a particular shape. But then there are organic repetitions that occur in the trees, and more particularly in the bushes that occur in the right part of the picture plane. And then the striation of elongated shadows in the lower part of the picture plane. We can determine, and this is one thing that reinforces this whole idea of nostalgia for me, we can determine the time of year that this is. It's in the winter. The trees are devoid of leaves. The shadows are elongated, which is typical of early morning or late afternoon in wintertime. That, for me, reinforces a sense of nostalgia in this. Also, the artist does a spatial activity here that's very similar to another piece that we talked about just a moment ago, and that is this in and out kind of play. In the left part of the picture plane, we have this recession into depth, into the landscape. And then in the lower right part of the composition, there's this advancing out into the viewer space, also with landscape elements. So we have this position of the house that is parallel to the picture plane, because it's two planes that are facing each other, basically. The implied picture plane, which is parallel to the viewer, and the house that is parallel to the viewer and the picture plane. And then we have this diagonal thrust into the picture plane with the landscape on the left, and projection out on the projection of the trees on the right. That, I think, is just picture perfect again. And then there's this one little anomaly. It's a sign that's on the left, and it again encapsulates the shapes of the windows, that same rectilinear shape, but in one isolated location. Everything is held together just beautifully. Now, somebody might say, well, what's the big deal? The artist came upon this setting, snapped a photograph, and did a drawing of that. Well, that's not necessarily the case. The artist may have taken a photograph, but only after positioning themselves in just the right location to get all these visual factors in place. And I'm not saying that the artist was thinking, oh, I've got to get these diagonals here. Oh, this interval has to work this and that. It's sensed, it's seen, it's known immediately. Or if the artist is a plein air artist, then they had to be positioned in that location and select very carefully how all these components would work in concert. So what seems to be an easeful work of art is one of intense strategy and sheer beauty. Oh, I could talk endlessly about this, but I'll try to keep it as short and succinct as possible. Talk about enigma. This is one of the most enigmatic pieces in this entire show. It's in terms of concept. We have two figures here. We can identify them as male and female. We also have to think about the title, Goddess of War. And at one moment, it seems almost be antithetical to what is presented here. And it may very well be that's the intention of the artist. If the Goddess of War is the antagonist, why is the female figure appearing not to be the antagonist within this composition? But I think the artist is deliberately creating a kind of ambiguity here in terms of subject to make the viewer question. Now, first of all, in terms of the composition, the imagery is right up against the picture plane. It's confrontational immediately. The artist has created a series of diagonals. Well, they actually begin as horizontals, intervals that are horizontals in the lower part of the picture plane, suggesting a more restive kind of orientation. And this is where the female form creates the most restive element in the picture plane. And then we have the shift of diagonal of the arm of the male figure. And then if you look at the instrument he's holding, that's a vertical. So there's this sort of gradation of intervals that move from the horizontal to the diagonal to the vertical. That creates a lot of momentum within the composition and reinforces the drama of the composition. So I wonder after a while, what is this male figure holding here? Is it a tattoo needle, or is it some kind of other tool that's used in tattoos? And the reason I ask is because he has tattoos all over his arm, and that's a form of graphic art presentation. Then I see the jacket or the outfit that the female is wearing, and that's a graphic presentation, graphic art presentation, or graphic novel reference. And then start thinking of goddess of war, and then you start thinking of superheroes, and this is a female superhero, but is she overpowered by this male figure, or is he overpowered by her? Is he succumbing to her in some way? It's all this ambiguity is conveyed with no direct answers. And then I think of contrasting works of art in the history of Western art. For instance, Artemisia Gentileschi's beheading of Holofernes, one of the major paintings of the Western canon. Compositionally, there's very similar characteristics going on with that. The thrust of diagonals and the rest of horizontals, etc., and the dramatic lighting, very, very comparable. But there's an inversion in the selection of the subject matter. I can't help but think there's some deliberate reference to that. And we also think about Caravaggio, Rembrandt, a number of other artists who use this sort of tenebrist approach to create this drama, this theatrical drama within the setting of the work. And just the reference of a realistic portrayal of these two figures and the graphic portrayal in tattoos and in clothing, that juxtaposition of different stylistic approaches, I think, is simply marvelous in this. There is a great deal of mystery, and at the same time, such sheer beauty, and this is sublime. It's really sublime because it is beautiful and it's troubling at the same time. I can't resolve this, and that's what I love about this particular work. Now, in terms of the craft, the artist demonstrates again how digital photography can take on any number of different visual characteristics. This reads so much like classical painting. There's a whole tradition of grisaille underpainting that was done exclusively in grays, or, as I was mentioning before, tenebrist paintings that really rely a great deal on extreme light-dark contrasts. But the artist really understands the medium so well that they could capture this kind of range of tone and still allude to what we consider to be classical painting. These are 5 really dynamite works, completely dynamite works. But every piece in the show has some really outstanding characteristics to it. And I was very thrilled to look at all of them. I must say this, the juring process is often said to be a subjective one. And there's a certain degree of truth in that because every juror has their own set of preferences, perhaps prejudices, familiarity, etc. Nonetheless, there's got to be some way that the juror can substantiate why they select works as they do. So I hope that any of my prejudices or preferences that have come out of this interview, at the same time, may demonstrate my attempt to be impartial in terms of the selection of work, in terms of the concept or composition or craft. If something strikes me, if something resonates with me, I then have to determine why. And that's why I get into the issues of concept, composition, and craft.